What if death is not the end, but only sleep? What if the empty tomb of Christ is not just history, but the first sign of a harvest yet to come? Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15 confront us with a question that shakes the foundations of faith. If Christ has not been raised, then all hope collapses. But if he has been raised, then everything changes, for him, for us, and for the world. Here's the heart of my argument. Paul is not only defending Christ's resurrection, or even the resurrection of believers. Revelation 20 sheds light on his words, showing us three resurrections woven together. Christ as the firstfruits, the sleeping saints awakening, and finally the great multitude before the throne. If resurrection is denied, all three collapse. But if Christ is raised, all three stand secure, and our hope is unshakable. Paul doesn't stop there. He moves from what collapses if Christ is not raised to what stands firm, because he has been raised. In verses 20 through 28, Paul unfolds the order of resurrection. Christ first, then those who belong to him at his coming, and finally the end, when every enemy is destroyed and death itself is abolished. This is not just one resurrection, but a sequence, a pattern that Revelation 20 helps us see more clearly. Christ is the firstfruits, the saints are the harvest, and the great multitude stands before the throne. Together, these resurrections reveal the victory of God's kingdom and the final defeat of death.
But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, after that those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 to 24, Paul lays out the order of resurrection. Christ has been raised as the firstfruits, guaranteeing that those who belong to him will also be raised at his coming. This is the second resurrection, the harvest of the saints who have fallen asleep. But Paul doesn't stop there. He continues with the phrase, "Then comes the end," when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father after destroying every rule and every authority and power. Here, Paul is describing a sequence. Christ first, then his people, and finally the end itself. That phrase, "then comes the end," in verse 24, points to a third resurrection, though it is harder to see at first glance. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 to 14, makes this clearer, describing the great white throne judgment where all the dead are raised, the final resurrection of humanity. Paul's words and John's vision together reveal three resurrections: Christ as the firstfruits, the saints as the harvest, and the great multitude before the throne. This final resurrection is not only the climax of history, but the moment when death itself is destroyed and the kingdom is handed over to the Father. In the Jewish tradition, the offering of firstfruits was a sacred act of trust and thanksgiving. At the Feast of Firstfruits, the people brought the very first sheaf of grain from the harvest and presented it to God in the temple. This offering was not the whole harvest, but it was a pledge, a sign that the rest of the crop belonged to him and would surely follow. The firstfruits carried both gratitude for what God had already given and confidence in what he was yet to provide. Paul takes this image and applies it to Christ's resurrection. Just as the first sheaf guaranteed the full harvest, Christ's rising from the dead guarantees the resurrection of all mankind. He is the first of God's harvest, the proof that death has been broken and that resurrection is sure. But Paul makes clear that this harvest is not uniform. Some will be raised to everlasting life and others to judgment. Christ as the firstfruits means his resurrection is both the beginning and the assurance of the final destiny of every human being. When Paul speaks of those who are Christ's at his coming, 1 Corinthians 15:23, He identifies a specific group. The redeemed who belong to Christ by faith are sealed by His Spirit and await His return. These are the saints who have fallen asleep in Christ and those still alive at His appearing. They are distinct from the rest of humanity because they are His possession, purchased by His blood, joined to Him in resurrection hope, and destined to share in His victory. Paul then places this resurrection at Christ's coming, which precedes the final defeat of death itself. Revelation 20 clarifies the timeline. Christ's coming ushers in the resurrection of His saints, who reign with Him for 1,000 years. Only after this millennial reign does the final resurrection occur, when death and Hades are destroyed at the great white throne judgment, Revelation chapter 20, verse 14. In other words, the resurrection of those who are Christ's is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the final sequence that culminates in the complete abolition of death. When Paul writes, "Then comes the end," in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 24, he points to the climax of God's plan, when every enemy is destroyed and the kingdom is handed over to the Father. He makes it clear that death itself is the last enemy to be abolished. This means that the story of resurrection does not end with Christ or even with the saints at His coming. The end Paul describes is the moment when death, which has reigned over all humanity since Adam, is finally defeated and removed from existence. Revelation 20 shows us when this final defeat of death takes place. After the saints are raised to reign with Christ, John describes the great white throne judgment, where the rest of humanity is raised. The third resurrection. Here, all the dead stand before God to be judged, and it is in this moment that death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 to 14. Death itself is not only overcome, but abolished, so that even the idea of death is taken out of existence. This is the true end Paul speaks of, the final victory where life reigns and death is no more. We have seen that Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, 20-28 reveal not just one resurrection, but a sequence of three. Christ as the firstfruits, the saints raised at His coming, and finally the rest of humanity at the end, when death itself is abolished. Revelation 20 helps us see this pattern more clearly, showing how the victory of Christ unfolds until even the idea of death is taken out of existence. Together, these passages assure us that resurrection is inevitable, judgment is real, and life in Christ is the only hope that endures. We're building a space for honest, grace-filled discovery. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe and click the bell to stay connected. Thanks for watching.